Every time a Black person is killed, the lie arrives faster than the facts. He had a gun. He was high. She was threatening. He went for his weapon. He looked dangerous. He whistled. Before the name is even cold on the timeline, the justification is already trending. And lately, something else has been trending too. People saying, they're killing Americans now. And every time I hear that, something in my chest drops because what I and a lot of Black people and people of color aren't hearing is concern. We're hearing a revelation. It's the quiet part being said out loud because the now implies that there was a time when this didn't count. It implies that there was a group that this violence belonged to. And it implies that some deaths only become unjust once they've reached the right people. I want to pause here and say this clearly. If you consider yourself an ally, or if you're confused by the anger and grief you're seeing from people of color right now, I need you to stay with me for this episode. Please don't scroll away. Please don't tune it out. This matters more than any solitary case. My name is Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught. And I had a true crime episode planned for this week. It was researched, outlined, and every time I sat down and recorded, I couldn't. Because something bigger is happening in this country, and pretending this is just another isolated tragedy feels dishonest. For 5 years, you have trusted me to talk about violence, justice, and accountability with honesty. So today, instead of a case, I need to talk to you about a pattern. I need to talk about the lie, and I need to explain why that phrase, they're killing Americans now, is landing like confirmation for people who have been buried under this violence for generations. This episode isn't about politics. It isn't about partisanship. It's about citizenship, who gets it, who it's conditional for, and who only seems to count once it's already too late. If you have ever trusted my perspective before, I'm asking you to stop and listen now. When people say they're killing Americans now, the word now is doing some heavy lifting. It implies that there was a before, a time when this kind of violence was tolerated. It implies there was a group this violence belonged to. And it implies that a line was only crossed when the victim fit a narrow definition of who qualifies as an American. For many Black people and people of color, that statement does not register as outrage. It registers as a confirmation. Confirmation that our deaths were never understood as civic crises, that our citizenship was always conditional, that we were seen not as full participants in the social contract, but as exceptions to it, acceptable losses within it. When you hear names like George Floyd, Sonia Massey, Tamir Rice, Eric Gartner, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, or Sandra Bland, it didn't provoke the same language, the same urgency, or the same insistence that this isn't who we are. Signals something deeply unsettling. The same is true for cases like Quan Pham and Phong Le. Their deaths did not produce sustained national reckoning. We also spent much of 2025 watching Hispanic communities subjected to mass detention and dehumanization with little public response. Indigenous Americans continue to be detained and harmed with minimal attention. Yet the killing of a white civilian suddenly reframes this issue as unprecedented violence. And that disparity matters, not because any one death is more tragic than another, but because selective recognition fractures movements and it erodes trust. Solidarity cannot survive if people feel like their humanity is only acknowledged retroactively or conditionally. What white Americans must understand is this: proximity to privilege is not immunity. White supremacy is always conditional. It protects compliance, not conscience. We have seen this before. During Jim Crow, white Americans who stood alongside Black people, who challenged segregation, who organized, who refused to uphold racial terror, they were beaten alongside of us. Some of them were jailed. Some were outright murdered. Their whiteness did not save them once they broke ranks with a system that demanded their silence. And that history matters because it makes clear that what is happening now is not an aberration. When people step outside the boundaries of what power allows, when they question authority, when they dispute the hierarchy, the system responds the way it always has, with force. Both Good and Pretty were not targeted because whiteness suddenly stopped existing. They were targeted because they stopped performing obedience. Good was a queer, outspoken woman who was unwilling to submit. She challenged misogyny and authority simultaneously, and that resistance was met with violence. Pretty was similarly punished for defiance, ignoring federal agents, intervening on behalf of someone who was being harmed, and refusing to perform deference to their power. That active refusal was met with force, captured from multiple angles in public view. This is the lesson that history keeps offering us. The moment privilege is mistaken for protection, people are caught unprepared. Compliance might buy temporary safety, but has never guaranteed justice. That reality is not new. It is simply more familiar now than it has been in the past. Now, Black Americans are often told after moments like this isn't who we are. This isn't what America stands for. The system failed. But a system cannot fail at something it was never designed to prevent. From the very beginning, American citizenship has been conditional, granted selectively, enforced unevenly, and withdrawn whenever it became inconvenient. In 1790, the Naturalization Act restricted citizenship to free white persons. And in 1857, Dred Scott versus Sanford made it explicit. Black people, enslaved or free, were said to have no rights which the white man was bound to respect. After slavery, Black codes and vagrancy laws criminalized Black existence to preserve control in another form. Plessy versus Ferguson told us that segregation was constitutional as long as inequality was made orderly. Even when rights were finally acknowledged on paper, they were never enforced equally in practice. So citizenship became conditional on race, on behavior, on how non-threatening you appear in someone else's imagination. But the same logic didn't stop with just Black Americans. Chinese immigrants were excluded by law in 1882. Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, were imprisoned during World War II. Under Korematsu versus the United States, not because they had done anything wrong, but for who they might be. Mexican Americans were deported in mass during the 30s, and then again during Operation Wetback, which is, I can't believe that's legally what they called that. But it was often done without regard for their citizenship. Puerto Ricans were surveilled, sterilized, and met with state violence despite being legal American citizens. Each time the justification was the same: national security, public safety, order. And each time, due process was treated as optional. So when Good or Pretty is killed and people suddenly say this is unjust, what many of us are hearing is not awakening, it's timing. It sounds like, oh, so it counts now. And that doesn't feel like solidarity. It feels like being told again that our deaths have always been background noise. That violence only becomes a national crisis once it reaches people who were assumed to be safe from it. This isn't about denying anyone's humanity. It's about recognizing how long ours has been debated. See, the lie is never about the truth. It's about permissions. It doesn't matter if the gun was fake, as it was with Tamir Rice, because American law has long allowed lethal force based on perceived threat rather than actual danger. It doesn't matter if the drugs were irrelevant to the case, as they were with George Floyd, because criminalization has always been used to posthumously justify violence, from slave patrol reports to modern police press releases. It doesn't matter if the water on the stove was boiling, like in Sonia Massey's case, because ordinary actions have historically been reframed as threatening when performed by Black bodies. It doesn't matter if the threat was entirely imaginary, as it was with Elijah McClain, because fear itself has always been treated as sufficient evidence. And it does not matter if the accusation was a myth, like it was with Emmett Till, because American history shows us that the claim has never needed to be true, only believable to a certain audience. It's not new, guys. During slavery, enforcers documented punishments as discipline to justify torture. During Reconstruction, Black codes criminalized unemployment and loitering to justify arresting people and forcing them into labor. During the Jim Crow era, lynchings were routinely defended as responses to alleged threats that were later proven false if they were investigated at all. In the early 20th century, police reports and newspapers regularly framed Black victims as aggressors to rationalize mob violence and state inaction. The lie has always functioned the same way, not to investigate what happened, but to explain why it just didn't matter. And that logic was later codified into law. In Graham versus Connor in 1989, the Supreme Court ruled that police use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer in the moment, not by its actual outcome, not by the harm it caused, and not by facts that we learned afterward. That standard prioritizes perception over reality. In Tennessee versus Garner, 1985, lethal force was limited in theory, but still allowed wherever an officer claims to perceive a significant threat. In other words, the system doesn't require the lie to even be true. It only requires it to be legible. America just keeps recycling the same justification because it works. It dulls the public outrage by shifting focus away from the violence itself. It stalls accountability by turning every death into a debate and the victim's worthiness. And it transforms the public into a jury and it asks us to evaluate character rather than conduct, while the state's power is presumed legitimate by default. This isn't an institutional breakdown. This is institutional continuity. The lie is not a bug in the system. It's a feature. James Baldwin said it plainly in 1964 in Nothing Personal. The violence was being perpetuated mainly against Black men, and so it didn't count. But if a society permits one portion of its citizenry to be menaced or destroyed, then very soon no one in that society is safe. Baldwin was not speculating. He was documenting a pattern that was already decades old. He went on to warn, the forces thus released in the people can never be held in check, but run their devouring course, destroying the very foundations which it was imagined they would save. And finally, he named the cost. What we are struggling against is that death in the heart, which leads to not only the shedding of blood, but which reduces human beings to corpses while they live. I'll say it again. It didn't count. That's the context that a lot of people are missing right now. Because when violence is permitted against one group long enough, a country doesn't become safer. It becomes practiced at explaining itself. It learns the language of evasion. It develops a moral callous. This is why Black Americans are so angry. Not confused, not shocked, but furious. Because the nation did not fail to understand what was happening. It learned how to survive it, how to anesthetize itself with character assassination, how to call murder context and brutality complexity, how to replace accountability with endless debates over tone, compliance, and perceived threat. And every time we accept this setup, was he really reaching? Was she really threatening? We are participating in the lie because those questions are never asked in good faith. It's not designed to uncover the truth. It's designed to decide whose life is worth defending after the fact. Baldwin warned us that once a society normalizes this kind of moral triage, the violence cannot remain contained. And the same logic that once rendered Black suffering invisible will expand outward because the system has already learned that it can. This isn't hindsight. It's history speaking in real time. And here's the uncomfortable truth. What's happening now doesn't feel new to us. What feels new is who people are finally willing to recognize as victims. The machinery didn't suddenly appear. It didn't suddenly become violent. It didn't suddenly abandon restraint or due process. This system was built with those exceptions already baked in. What changed is not the behavior of the state. It's the identity of the people now caught in the gears. The violence didn't escalate. It simply expanded into spaces where it was never supposed to go. For generations, there have been an unspoken understanding about who this system exists to protect, who it is allowed to discipline, contain, or discard. Some people were always treated as citizens, and others were treated as problems to be managed. So when someone says, they're killing Americans now, it doesn't sound like an awakening. It sounds like a line being crossed. Not because the violence became unjust, but because it became inconvenient. It feels like a belated recognition. Like discovering a fire only once it reaches the room that you assumed was fireproof. And for those of us who have lived with the smoke for generations, that distinction matters. Remember, James Baldwin warned that a society that allows some people to be destroyed cannot contain the forces it unleashes. Violence cannot and does not stay neatly assigned to its original targets. In the United States, indigenous nations were the first testing ground. The government declared Native people were savages, denied their sovereignty, and used military force, forced removal, starvation, and mass killing as policy. The Trail of Tears was a legally sanctioned ethnic cleansing. Wounded Knee was a massacre. Residential schools abducted children to erase language, culture, and identity. Reservations were enforced through continued military violence. The lesson was clear. Some lives could be erased for the so-called greater good. That logic was refined and expanded through slavery. Enslaved Africans were considered property. Violence was legalized, regulated, and it became economic. Punishment was public and instructional, designed not just to control people, but to terrorize entire communities into submission. Slave patrols are the direct ancestors of modern policing, and they were created to capture escaped and free Black people, enforce racial hierarchy, and maintain order through fear. When slavery ended, the violence didn't. It was just rebranded. Black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow, lynching through social control. The lie became necessary. Black people said to themselves, if we're free, then this violence must be justified. That guy must have done something to deserve it. And the same machinery just kept chugging forward. Native Hawaiians saw their sovereign government overthrown in 1893, their land seized, and U.S. Marines occupying their homeland, reframing it as annexation. Chinese immigrants built the railroads that connected our nation, thousands dying in the process, only to be repaid with the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first law to ban immigration based on race. During World War II, over 120,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned in internment camps. No charges, no evidence, no due process, just collective suspicion. They might be dangerous. After Jim Crow ended, the violence pivoted again. Mexican Americans were lynched. In 1954, Operation Wetback deported over 1 million people, many of whom were U.S. citizens, branding the Latino identity itself as illegal. After 9/11, Muslim people, Arab people, and South Asian communities were subjected to surveillance without warrants, detention without charges, deportation without evidence. Entire communities positioned as threats. And here's the part that people miss. For many groups, this violence comes in waves during war, panic, or crisis. But for Black Americans, it's never really ended. Policing, incarceration, surveillance, and lethal force have become permanent domestic applications of the same logic first used against Native Americans and enslaved Africans. That's why when people say they're killing Americans now, what Black people hear is, you weren't the Americans we meant. Because the formula has always been consistent. Dehumanize the group, label them dangerous, suspend their rights, call it necessary, forget it later. The targets change. The script doesn't. And James Baldwin warned us, if a society permits one portion of its citizenry to be menaced or destroyed, then very soon no one in that society is safe. What we are witnessing right now is not a breakdown or a deviation. It is the bill coming due. The logical outcome of a system that has been excusing itself for over 400 years. A system that has rotted institutions, brutalized language, and hollowed out the public consciousness. What we are witnessing is not a string of isolated tragedies. It's a governing philosophy being exercised in real time. The lie no longer whispers, it legislates, it campaigns, it trends. State violence is no longer treated as a regrettable failure, but as a necessary tool. Due process has been reframed as an inconvenience. Empathy is now weakness. Dissent is a threat. We are living in a political climate where power is openly testing how much force it can use, how many rights it can suspend, how many people it can discard before the word American loses all meaning. And what makes this moment dangerous is not just who is being harmed. It's just how many people are being asked to accept it as normal. to see brutality as order, to see fear as governance, to see disappearance as policy. We were warned that once a society decides some lives must justify the existence of others, it has already surrendered its moral center. The bloodshed is only the visible damage. The deeper devastation is what happens when the public conscience goes quiet. It is not a question of unity. It is a question of honesty. Because a nation that only recognizes injustice once it reaches certain people was never built on equal protection to begin with. And a country that teaches its citizens to look away or explain away will eventually find there is nowhere left to stand that isn't soaked in the same logic. My name is Brittany Ransom, and this has been an alternate episode of When Killers Get Caught. No one should have to die to be recognized as human. And if that idea feels radical in this country right now, that should terrify us all.